Welcome to our Sustainably Wed Head Table series. In this series, we are talking with experts about how to make the wedding industry more sustainable. And today we're going to be talking about low-waste weddings. What is a low-waste wedding? How do we make them happen? And how do we shift our industry towards low-waste so that that is the norm rather than the exception? If you've watched some of our other episodes, you'll know that we started this series by talking with wedding vendors and couples about how to make individual weddings more sustainable. But what we realized through that process is that there are so many experts outside of our industry who know so much about this and who are doing this in their day-to-day work that we as wedding industry professionals can really learn from, and we can leverage that expertise into our own work. So that's what we wanted to do with this series. Now, before I introduce these two, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt, and the Songhees First Nations. We're also very lucky to be at the Parkside Hotel, which is an incredible event space as well as a very sustainable hotel. And we're actually going to talk about that more in another episode, so I won't introduce all the sustainable things that they're doing, but it's very cool. Check it out if you haven't already. Now, these two. To my left, we have Rhiannon Moore. Rhiannon, you are a zero waste expert. You're a science outreach educator. You have researched microplastics in the ocean. You were nominated one of Canada's top 30 under 30 sustainability leaders in 2018, as well as several other accolades that I have forgotten since. But you also worked with the City of Victoria in their outreach. Can you tell us a little bit about their program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm the Zero Waste Outreach Coordinator for the City of Victoria. So actually working for the engineering department, but working on communications and policy on waste reduction.
Amazing. And to my right, we have Natasha. You may recognize Natasha if you watched our other episodes in the series. Of course, Natasha was on Zoom at that point, but you exist in person.
I have a bottom half to me, yes.
Yeah, nice to see you in real life. Yes, not just over Zoom. Natasha, you are a wedding planner at Clearwater Events, which you own and operate, but you also co-founded The Good Green, which is a resource hub and online community for wedding vendors and event professionals to help them move towards more sustainable, better practices. Can you tell us a little bit more about The Good Green?
No.
That's fine. That's fine.
That was great.
Look it up.
Blooper reel. We're just giving you content.
We've lost it.
We've lost it. Yeah. And so let's talk about low waste. So I want to start this conversation by defining terms. And I think that we're going to be talking a little bit about what a linear economy is, what a circular economy is. And I want to make sure that we are all kind of on the same page about what that all means. And anybody watching will know what those terms are. So Rhiannon, I want to ask you first, what is a linear economy and why is that model problematic?
Mm-hmm. So a linear economy is basically exactly what it sounds like. So things follow a very linear fashion. So if I were to, let's say, have a plastic fork, there's the extraction phase, there's the manufacture phase, there's the use, which is probably 5 minutes, maybe even less, and then there's disposal. So there's not really any intervention within that stream. It's just point 1 to point 2, extraction, use, disposal. The circular economy, which I think we'll talk about a little bit on this episode, is kind of rejects all that and looks at things more as how can we reuse and reduce things within that cycle. So not just continuing to extract and continuing to use and continuing to dispose, but reuse is a lot within the circular economy.
Right. And am I right in saying that in a circular economy, waste really becomes either a resource or ideally we don't have any waste, but if there is waste, it becomes a resource that we can then put back in, say as raw materials.
Yeah, we often talk about that in my field as waste is a resource, waste is a commodity. Waste doesn't need to be waste, it's simply a material. And waste is also a design flaw. So things should be designed with reuse or repurposing within it, but often things are designed now where they will break down very quickly. Not break down in the organic sense, but break down as in my TV broke and I need to buy a new one in 2 years type thing.
Right.
That's called planned obsolescence, actually. And it makes you buy new things all the time. And that's a very resource intensive process. And it kind of makes you realize that waste reduction is also kind of a form of climate action, because when we're extracting so much and we're using so much and disposing so much, it of course has climate impacts.
For sure. And I imagine a big category within that is single-use items.
Yes.
Yeah, which we will get to, especially as we start talking about weddings. But before we bring weddings into the conversation, I know that the City of Victoria has outlined a waste reduction plan and hierarchy. And so I have it written down here that includes eliminating the unnecessary, making reuse the norm, and then finally recycling what's left over. So is that a move at, say, a city level or municipal level to a circular model?
Yeah, it's definitely meant to shift towards a circular model. The waste reduction hierarchy, it sounds fancy, but it's honestly, we learn it as children. Reduce, reuse, recycle. So it's in a hierarchy because reduction is the most impactful thing. So not even using or like extracting those resources if you don't need them. Then reuse. I think we all know what reuse is. So this is a reusable cup here. Our clothes are technically reusable. We wear them again and again. And then recycling is at the bottom because it's important, but it's also, if we can do the other things, like eliminating the unnecessary and making reuse the norm, then we don't need to recycle. And recycling does require energy as well to do. And usually recycling is like you're kind of downcycling as well. So as a city, we recognize that it's important to kind of follow that hierarchy if we're going to reach our waste reduction targets by 2050. So.
And I imagine, I know myself, like you try and make the right choice when you're buying a product and you think, oh, well, this is biodegradable or something like that, or at least it's labeled biodegradable. But that often isn't the best choice, right? And that's where that hierarchy comes in.
Yeah, and you highlighted a really good point there, which is there's a lot of greenwashing that happens, and people do gravitate towards biodegradability and compostability, and there are things that are truly biodegradable. Well, technically everything is biodegradable, but eventually. Yeah. But it's not necessarily the best option. The best option is usually reuse or just not even needing that product to begin with. And right now, a really big issue is actually plastics and things that are labeled as compostable that actually aren't. So it's actually best to choose reusable products, even if they are plastic, versus a product that is labeled compostable or biodegradable that really isn't.
Well, let's think about this in the context of a wedding then. And Natasha, I'm turning to you to be our wedding expert. Because, you know, when you think about a wedding, obviously it is this one-time event. And so you can kind of gravitate towards single-use items. Especially if you're a couple trying to plan this event, maybe you haven't planned an event this size before, it is tempting to move towards single-use items because why would you have 80 cups, 80 plates, in your house? So can you talk us through, as a planner, you see the wedding from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, you see the wedding planning process from the beginning of that process until everything gets thrown out at the end of the night. Where do single-use items come up in that process?
I think the biggest is what you just touched on in terms of disposable wares. So plates, cutlery, cups, things like that. We also see it at the bar too. So for example, if cocktail hour, there are certain venue restrictions and you can't have glassware on the patio, for example, we see plastic cups and then plastic straws if you're doing cocktails or fancy drinks. And so that's another piece. We also see it with favors as well. So a lot of couples are loving to do personalized, engraved fancy candles that have their monograms on it. And those each come individually packaged in some sort of item. Even if you're doing a treat or a candy or an edible, like they're all coming packaged in something. So if we are going that route, can we try and find a more sustainable material that's not plastic? But also to Rhiannon's point too, I think we struggle in terms of single use because not every municipality is the same. So what might be recyclable, biodegradable, compostable, or can go in the recycle bin in one location might not be able to in another. So as planners and as vendors, it's really tricky to find that balance of what works sort of across the board in your region.
Right.
And that conversation is different for everyone, I think.
Right. And I think we do need to talk about that at a policy level. And so let's loop back to that. But before we do talk about that kind of higher level, when you are talking with a couple during the planning process, where and when should you have the conversation about single use? And how can couples who maybe aren't working with a planner mitigate their use of single use items?
So I think the first stage of planning is really coming up with your priorities, what you envision your day to look like, how you want it to look and feel. And then once you start diving into the logistics of practically, okay, so what are we having on our table? What are all the items that we need? Once you start purchasing or looking to get those items on site, then you can start thinking differently. Okay, can we rent items? Can we thrift from Facebook Marketplace? Can we go shopping at like your Salvation Army or something like that?
Does that align with events that you've seen? Like, I mean, we see weddings primarily as the events that we're at, but when you're at, say, a city event, do you see that kind of single-use problem and the same sort of mitigation strategy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we see it a lot at any kind of event, and especially if it's people that are just coming by to, be there for an hour. It's just like quick, grab your food, grab your drink, visit some booths. There's also a lot of swag involved with certain events. So people giving out things that have logos on them and stuff like that aren't necessarily essential. So it's definitely something we see at events within the city too. Yeah.
For sure. One of the things we talked about earlier in another episode of our series, which was last year, was it can be really hard for a couple to try and go 100% zero waste, right? Is that something that you find at city events as well? Is trying to push for zero waste just too much? Should we aim for low waste, or should we just go all out and go for zero and see what happens?
That's a very good question. I think that lots of people think, zero waste. There's no way you can get to zero waste. And I think in our work, we look at zero waste as a bit of a journey versus like a destination. And I know it sounds a bit corny, but we understand that lots of things are going to maybe be the lesser evil, or it'll be more low waste versus zero waste. The goal is to be as low waste as possible, and think of even things that are being composted and recycled as waste as well. So I still think of things that I throw in my recycling bin as waste, because it is still going somewhere and it probably is still being kind of downcycled. So just thinking about all the different places that things go, and trying to reach zero waste is very tricky, especially in events and industries that aren't necessarily used to incorporating a lot of waste reduction measures into their activities. But just because it does seem like a huge, ambitious target doesn't mean that you can't try, because you're still making a difference even if you're getting a little bit to zero waste. So
for sure, yeah. Well, I think you hit it on the head there for the wedding industry, is that maybe we're not used to doing this. Maybe that's just me, and maybe you see that differently. But the least romantic thing to think about when you're planning your wedding is like, what does your compost situation look like, right? Like we don't often have those conversations with couples, but maybe we should, because I imagine as a planner at the end of the night, when you are cleaning up all the stuff and tossing it into bags, sorting out the recycling and the compost and everything might be challenging.
Yes. And I will say, too, that it's not necessarily the responsibility of the couple per se. I think a lot of that responsibility falls on their vendors. And hopefully, throughout the planning process, they've chosen more ethical, more eco-friendly, more sustainable vendors. So that is part of their process already. And they have the infrastructure within their business to support that.
Now, we've been talking about single-use items, and what comes to mind are plastics, all that kind of thing. But food waste is another big problem, and I know that that's one of the City of Victoria's big priorities. Can you tell us a little bit about what managing food waste looks like at the citywide level?
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of like a web of many different connections, because food waste has a lot to do with the food system and goes well beyond the boundaries of a city or even a region. So it's quite complex, and it starts from even just growing the food. One thing that is kind of interesting is during the pandemic, the city actually converted a lot of our greenhouses that we would normally grow flowers for, like the hanging flowers around the city, to actually growing food and distributing it to community organizations.
Cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so there's different things like that. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily need to do with the end result of food waste, but it's looking at the food system in general and looking at that system, and making sure that system is also very resilient as well.
Right.
There's also a lot of really great organizations within the city that try to redistribute food that is about to go bad, which I think is a really, really important thing. Again, getting it to people in need. I read a stat the other day, and it was something like, mind you, this was in the States, but it was like 50% of the food that's actually produced is wasted.
Whoa.
In the US. It's probably similar in Canada.
Yeah.
And I think part of that, I mean, I'm not necessarily like a food systems expert. We actually do have a food systems coordinator at the city, but we just need to make sure that at every step of the way, we're not wasting things. And again, it's kind of like going back to that linear versus circular system. And we also, there is a lot of education to be done, I think, at like the household level. In terms of even shopping for your groceries, making sure that you plan out your meals, and then eat what you have in the fridge versus go out and get more food and then forget about the things at the back of the fridge and then toss them in the organics bin in however long you leave your fridge for. For me, probably a year. There's some interesting science projects at the back.
I am right there with you. Yeah. It's an interesting situation back there that I care not to think about. Yeah. But I mean, and I think that's so important at the household level, and great to be thinking about that at the citywide level as well, to be able to kind of coordinate that. Events kind of exist in this separate area where, in many ways, many events are just a lot of meals with some fancy things happening in between, right? And I mean, for some of the couples we work with, the dinner, the cocktail hour snacks, those are their highest priority. Food can be really important on a wedding day, but there can be a lot of waste as well. That's something we talked about a little bit in your series, but can you remind us, where does food waste happen, and how might couples be able to work with a caterer, say, to be able to reduce that food waste?
Yeah, so obviously a smaller wedding typically means less waste, but that's not always possible given family dynamics, cultural traditions, things like that. So working with a caterer is really important to try and minimize what that food waste looks like. The first thing I always say is think about the type of food service that you're doing. So typically a buffet service is going to have the highest probability for the most waste. So if you are doing a buffet because you want these umpteen items, which I think is a different conversation in and of itself, maybe have the buffet line staffed by your catering team. So instead of like Uncle Joe going up to the line and getting 4 heaping spoonfuls of mashed potatoes, he's only taking 1 and he can come back up if he wants some more later. If food is really important, I always say a plated meal or family style service is great, because the caterer can then better estimate the amount of food that's needed, and there's a less chance for overage. I will say too, in terms of food donation, the type of food that you're serving impacts the type of food that can get donated. So meat and seafood proteins aren't always able to get donated or given to others. So vegan, vegetarian is not only better for your footprint, there's higher likelihood that can get donated as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it might seem, the buffet always seems like a good choice because people can get what they want and all that kind of thing. You don't have to navigate the pick your meal on the invitation, but figuring out what to do with that leftover food, and probably your venue or caterer can help you have that conversation too, right?
And I will say, so I will sort of inject an anecdote here. So I was doing an event very early on in my career. It was at a big local hotel, and it was a plated meal, but part of their policy was to have all the options available for all of the guests. So this event had 250 people. There were 3 options, as there typically are. So they made 3 options for all 250 guests in the off chance that those guests would change their mind.
Whoa.
So when we think of downstream, like what that looks like, they may be giving that food to their staff as leftovers, but if not, where is all of that product going?
Yeah.
And how can we start to shift that conversation inside institutions too?
Well, and that's, I think, a good segue into what I want to ask next is that in our industry, we tend to put a lot of pressure on couples to make the right choices. That's kind of how the wedding industry will operate is we want couples to do all the research. We want them to pick the best vendors. We want them to know all about the end of life for all the products that they're choosing. And that's a lot of pressure to put on couples. I think they should do a lot of research, but I think a lot of the onus should be on businesses and vendors as well. And Rhiannon, when you're talking with a business owner, say in the city, where do you start to have that conversation about reducing their waste or moving towards a circular model? Because I imagine that can sometimes be a difficult conversation for a business that has always run one way. How do you navigate moving them towards a lower waste model?
Yeah, I think you made a good point in that it's a little bit of a two-way street. Businesses will adapt to what their customers want and want to meet their needs and their desires. So if people want convenience, businesses will provide convenience. And if people want reusable, then businesses will provide reusable. So I think it definitely goes both ways. And recognizing that when speaking to businesses is really important. So not necessarily expecting what changes are you going to make? Because maybe their customers don't want that. So it's kind of educating not only the business on more sustainable options and ways to reduce waste and food waste and plastic waste and all those things, but also on the other side, educating the consumers, saying these are the options available. Ask the business owner for this option if they have it. The more people ask, more saying, do you have this option, or do you have this type of product, or I don't necessarily need that with my order, the more businesses will be like, oh, maybe we don't need to add 10 different things of cutlery in this takeout order. Right. Or maybe we should ask people if they want their coffee in a reusable mug instead of automatically being disposable. So I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, having that pressure from consumers makes a lot of sense and does help move the industry for sure. And in that way, couples can make a real impact in the wedding industry, which is great. Now, Natasha, you are not just a wedding planner. That would be too easy. You also run and co-founded The Good Green, which works with businesses to help provide resources and move them towards more sustainable business practices in the event industry. So you get to have this conversation a lot with wedding vendors, event professionals. Mm-hmm. What's the kind of low-hanging fruit for a vendor who might want to make a low-waste journey or might want to start that journey, but doesn't know where to start?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think the first step, the sort of easy step, is do an audit with the products and materials that you use in your business the most. So, for example, a florist, what are they using to build their installations? What are they using in their centerpieces? Can we swap out those single-use materials for something that's reusable, like flower frogs, chicken wire, water tubes, things like that? And then not trying to change the whole infrastructure of your business in one go. I really think that making those gradual steps and making it more cumulative is actually more effective.
Right.
and those changes will still make a difference.
And I imagine you might be surprised along the way. Like if you start tracking your waste that's left over after an event, it might be a bit of a shock to measure that the first time and gradually reduce from there. But sometimes we just don't notice.
We don't know what we don't know, right?
Yeah.
And I think at the end of an event, we're all just wanting to get home because we're tired, and who cares what ends up in the car. So having a chance to step back, think objectively, sort of review the things that you're using is actually really beneficial, because even though the cost upfront to make those changes might be steep, the long-term impact, even in your business financially, you're going to see those returns.
So there's obviously a lot that businesses can do. There's a lot that couples can do and individual consumers. But we talked a little bit about policy and kind of things happening at a citywide, a municipal, maybe even provincial or federal level. Where do governments come in and where does policy come in to help move industries towards low waste? And I'm going to ask you first, Rhiannon, but then I'm going to ask you the same thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, policy is a very important tool. It's just one of many tools, so education is another tool. So you kind of need it working alongside multiple things. I would say policy comes into play in terms of, so at a municipal level, it's bylaws. So you can have single-use item bylaws. We have all sorts of different bylaws that could be enforced. And then there's also like regional guidelines. There's lots of education tools. And then at a provincial and federal level, that's an interesting, I don't know how to answer that question, actually.
That is okay.
I would say that.
See, I was hoping you would answer so that I don't have to.
No, that's probably the trickiest question that you've asked, just because I kind of consider events as like a bit of the Wild West.
100%.
They are,
Yeah. Like a lot of it, when you get your event permit, and we're actually looking at this as a city right now, there is a section for waste management, but we really need to look at waste reduction, not just saying, okay, yeah, you've got your garbage in place and you have some recycling and compost options, but have you considered bringing in a water truck instead of providing things in water bottles? Have you considered having staff actually at these waste receptacles helping you to sort it? So I think that cities can provide a lot of guidance and resources and support on that. So I think that that's policy, but it's also just like having the resources and staff time to be able to implement that. So I would say that that's super important.
Yeah.
You need people kind of spearheading it a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the Wild West is probably a very accurate way to describe our industry. I mean, we are not, typically in our industry, we're not certified, we're not regulated. It's a group of vendors who typically don't just work in weddings. Some people do just work in weddings, but a lot of us work on other events, other things. And so, I mean, the people who are looking after events and weddings, it's usually just individual vendors, right? Individual vendors, couples, that's it. So yeah, where does that impetus come from? How do we make change in this industry?
Oh, this is the $1 million question. I think I struggle with what's the responsibility of the business, but then what infrastructure is being provided by government and our local municipalities. So, for example, I was doing an event a handful of years ago, and this venue didn't even have recycling bins. That wasn't a part of what they had. They only had garbage bins. So unless I'm, as a vendor, bringing in these zero waste stations and all the other receptacles, the only option for us is to throw these things away. So I think from that standpoint, there needs to be a little bit of policy work and building up of the system, and then we can come in and support. The other thing is really education and outreach, right? So the more that these things are needed, the more that our vendors become educated, the more they feel supported to actually make the changes. And I think in this industry of sustainability, there is the talk that it's black and white, it's all or nothing, and that's not necessarily the best way to go about things. I would much rather someone implement a piece, make these changes, test that out for what works for them, what actually works in their local municipalities, and then again, build upon that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when we think about the event industry, often, in my role as a videographer, particularly, I think about the wedding day. I don't see the planning that happens before. I see some of it, but I don't see a lot of it. I don't see the events that happen before, like bachelorette or bachelor parties. There's a lot that goes on in a wedding that is not just that one day. So where else might we create waste that we should be mindful of?
Yeah, I would say that, well, some people go all out probably and have like an engagement party, and then they have a wedding shower, and then you have your bachelorette and the bachelor parties. And I would say that there's a lot of waste that happens from personally attending things like this. There's probably a lot of shirts that say, I'm with the bride sitting in a landfill right now, or different sashes, lots of different party decorations that are very specific to that day, but you likely won't use them again. Things like balloons and signs, things like that. I think you can find alternatives that are a lot more sustainable than some things that exist.
For sure. Have you come across similar things?
100%. I will say, if it's incredibly important to your wedding party, or that's they're dead set and maybe they haven't necessarily been educated on a more sustainable wedding, is always trying to sell it on Facebook or consign those items. So potentially there's another use for them after your event.
For sure. Well, and that kind of brings me to a big question that I'll send to both of you is, do we need to reimagine what a good time looks like? Like when you think of a party, your mental image might be balloons and confetti, right? Like if you're going to send one emoji that describes party, it could be confetti or it could be a balloon, right? That's what we think of. That's kind of standard party situation. How do we reconceive of what an event or a good time or a party looks like so that we remove that waste from the mental image? Who wants to take that one?
I mean, that's a very deep question.
You got very philosophical here.
Yeah, I mean, that's looking at our culture in general. And that's what we're talking about, right? Like changing the culture of things and changing our disposable culture and our linear culture to a more circular, like closing the loop, holistic thing. And that will happen over probably a long period of time. And we need those wasteful things removed from our culture so that we can put in place more sustainable things. Maybe we need to ask Apple to delete the balloon and confetti emoji and replace it with things that are, more important to us, truly, like family getting together.
For sure.
You can design that emoji.
I'll send a request.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be a group hug. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think on that note, shifting the culture of what a gathering is, I think of Priya Parker and the amazing work that she's doing. If you haven't read her book, this is my personal plug for The Art of Gathering. The book is amazing. And I think we're starting to see a shift in terms of culture and what the expectations of a wedding or any of the events that are surrounding it. So it's not necessarily about the item or the favor people are getting or what tangibly things look like on the day. It's much more about what kind of experiences can I give our guests? How do I want our guests to feel? What do I want them to leave with, like emotionally, from being a part of our day? And a lot of the time it's just gratitude, having an amazing time, focusing on like the food, the drink, and like the people that are there.
Yeah.
More so than the items itself.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, particularly around a wedding. Other events maybe don't have the same emotional impact, but a wedding certainly does. You can lean heavily on the emotional impact of a wedding because that's what you're there for, right? So we've got emotion on one side, but let's talk about the bottom line on the other. The very unromantic part of this is that it costs money, right? And when you're working with businesses, I imagine you come up against the argument that it is too expensive to make that change. Is that true? And how do you navigate that conversation?
Mm-hmm. I think especially when you look at things that are expertly marketed as sustainable. So it's very difficult for businesses to try to do the right thing when, let's say, this biodegradable product is 3 times the amount of, say, this like styrofoam container or this plastic container. That's where you kind of want to look at more longer term reuse. So upfront, if you invested in, say, like 10 ceramic mugs, it would be more expensive than investing in a whole bunch of disposable cups. But then in the long run, you don't have to continue buying those disposable items because you have that ceramic mug. So upfront, some things that are more sustainable can be more expensive, I would say, but in the long run, hopefully they pay off. It's tough because a lot of things do come down to the bottom line, and weddings are incredibly expensive anywhere. So you'll start to be like, oh, well, where can we save? And unfortunately, the environment is often the last thing that people think of. We just need to shift it to kind of the first thing that people think of.
Right. Yeah. Or at least, think about it in terms of a double bottom line, like cost and environment. But maybe we also need to think about the social impact of these products. And then, when you think about replacing one item for a biodegradable one, then again, looking at your municipality and is that actually biodegradable where we are? It might not be, right? Do you find these conversations come up at the Good Green as well?
100%. We talk about it a lot. And I think that's maybe my number one tip for vendors specifically is going and talking to your fantastic outreach workers at your local municipality and just getting education around what systems and infrastructure we have built within our local regions. Here in BC, I think it's challenging because each municipality can be so different, and so you will start to see across regional lines. Yeah,
there's some variance there, and that can make things really challenging, for sure. And in that sense, a business that buys, say, biodegradable products that aren't biodegradable in that municipality, they might not be purposefully greenwashing, but those products might not be the best choice. So they might be trying to do the right thing. But it might end up not being the best thing. So in that case, again, looking towards that circular model rather than a linear, because if it's biodegradable, you're still throwing it out at the end, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would also say that it is important to check with your municipality and what can go in the green bin. But I have not heard of any industrial compost facility that would be able to actually handle compostable plastics across Canada. So I would just scratch compostable plastics fully off your list, no matter where you live. But looking at paper products, definitely, and plastic products, where you can bring it to be recycled is super important.
Right, which is a real bummer because you figure you buy the compostable one, you've made a good choice, and you have made a better choice. But if we can't compost that in Canada, then what are we doing with that?
Yeah, the reality is like compostable plastics, they have been tested more in a lab setting, not necessarily a field setting, and it takes like 9 days for like a banana peel to run through an industrial compost facility, where a compostable plastic is certified for 90 days. So you'd have to run it through so many times. And a compost facility it's a business as well. They're not going to put things in the input to get, plastic filled soil at the end. So some will say that they accept the products, but oftentimes they are filtered out just because it's not a good material to have in their end product.
So I want to ask you both, if you had one piece of advice for a wedding vendor or business who works in this industry and wants to move towards a low waste model, what would that one key piece of advice be? I'll start with you, Rhiannon.
That's a good question. I wish I could give them all of the tips, but start where you are, and don't get too overwhelmed with, we need to have the perfect zero waste wedding. And why I think that the key thing is people get really overwhelmed by, what difference am I going to make?
Right.
Why would I want to make all these changes when all these other industries and all these other people are not doing it? It's just a drop in the bucket. And I've always said, it's not necessarily like, yes, that drop in the bucket is very small, but it's about the ripples that drop creates. So it's like people, every step along the way, you are asking these questions, looking for alternatives, and people start to notice and change their practices based on that. I always say it's like a monkey see, monkey do thing, and it's not necessarily. It's kind of like if I brought my like a reusable produce bag to the grocery store and started using it, and people at the grocery store saw me use it, and then the person at the checkout saw me use it, and they're like, oh yeah, and you start to really think of that. To me, I think it's a lot more impactful to do that than go around to everyone in the grocery store and say, you should be doing this.
Right.
Da, 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 da. So I think that, you know, your actions will speak louder than you think in terms of trying to make a difference.
For sure. Awesome. Good answer.
Thank you.
Yes. What do you think, Natasha?
Oh man, this, I would say a couple of things. So come from a place of curiosity and open-mindedness, and just knowing that, again, you don't need to make all these changes all at once, but coming from a place of, I want to learn, I want to grow, I want my business to do better and be better. So what are the things that I can do? And just sort of check those items off the list gradually. Would be my sort of big thing. I will also say that in the events industry, we are historically in the top 5 GDP-wise. So if we are going to make an impact, we are the people to do it. And that small steps and those small pieces of accountability will actually make a big difference when we start to put together the big puzzle pieces of our industry.
Amazing. Well, I can't add anything good to that. Other than I think, you know, it is easy to overcomplicate this. It's easy to overthink this. When you're planning a wedding as a couple, you already have 1,000 decisions to make, and making decisions about the end of life of products or, you know, the vendors you're bringing in. That's just added things that are important. They're super important. But again, leaning on your vendors to help you with that can help lift that stress a little bit, make it a little bit easier. And you can feel good leaning on your vendors who know all about that, right?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Well, that's an cautiously optimistic note to end on. I want to thank you both for talking about this today. There's so much room, I think, in our industry to grow, but there are good steps happening. And it's really encouraging to have conversations about reducing the waste in our industry. And hopefully we'll move towards low waste being the norm rather than the exception. Yes. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Woohoo! And you can edit out that last moment. Thank you.
Yeah.